The airplane cabin buzzed with the low hum of engines, the shuffle of passengers finding their seats, and the impatient sighs of businessmen in crisp suits. Overhead compartments slammed shut one after another, voices mingled in the narrow aisles, and the air smelled faintly of leather and reheated food. First class gleamed at the front, a world of wide seats and polished glasses, while the back filled with cramped rows and tired families juggling bags. Malik sat quietly near the middle, hugging his faded backpack against his chest. He was 14, though his eyes carried years far heavier. His jeans were worn thin at the knees and his t-shirt was clean but stretched from use. This was his first time flying alone, a trip to visit the grandmother who had promised to take him in after his mother's sudden passing. He leaned his head against the window, trying to push back the knot of grief that sat heavy in his chest. Outside, the runway lights flickered like distant stars, a reminder that the world stretched bigger than the life he knew. Still, he felt small, just another boy invisible to the crowd around him. In first class, Richard Bennett adjusted his expensive watch and glanced irritably at his phone. A millionaire investor known for his ruthless deals, he was used to controlling every room he entered. But today, the one thing he couldn't control was his infant daughter, who squirmed in his wife's tired arms. The baby had begun fussing even before the plane left the gate, and the sound quickly rose above the drone of boarding announcements. "Can't you get her to stop?" Richard hissed at his wife, his voice sharp enough to draw glances. "I'm trying," she whispered, bouncing the child gently. But the cries only grew louder, echoing down the aisle like a siren. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some rolling their eyes, others covering their ears. A woman muttered, "This is going to be a long flight." A businessman sighed dramatically, glaring at the baby as if his disapproval alone could silence her. Malik watched quietly, his chest tightening with a mixture of sympathy and memory. His little sister used to cry like that, inconsolable on nights when their mother worked late shifts. Malik had been the one to hold her, pacing their small apartment, humming lullabies their mother had taught him. He had learned how patience could calm a storm, that anger only made worse. The baby's cries pulled him back to the present. He could see the desperation in the mother's eyes, the way her hands trembled as she tried everything she knew. Malik wanted to help, but he stayed silent. He was just a boy from the streets. What right did he have to speak in a world that never listened to him? Richard, red-faced and embarrassed, flagged down a flight attendant. "Do something?" "People are staring." The attendant, flustered, offered a smile to soothe the tension, but it didn't mask the exhaustion in her eyes. She gently suggested rocking the baby or walking her down the aisle, but Richard dismissed the advice with a wave of his hand. "Worthless," he muttered under his breath, glaring at anyone who dared to look too long. Malik shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening on his backpack strap. He felt that familiar sting, the way people with power looked down on those without it, the way kindness was treated as weakness. He whispered to himself, barely audible over the noise, "She doesn't need anger. She just needs calm." But no one heard him. The plane doors closed with a heavy thud, sealing in the mix of wealth, struggle, and silent judgments. As the engines roared to life, Malik stared at the crying child, unaware that her voice would soon tie his fate to Richard Bennett's, and force the world to see a boy it had tried so long to ignore. The plane leveled out high above the clouds, the seatbelt sign chiming off. Passengers loosened ties, adjusted blankets, and tried to sink into the long hours ahead. But the peace everyone hoped for was shattered by the sound that refused to fade, the baby's wailing. Her tiny face was red, her fists clenched, and her cries cut through every conversation. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his wide leather seat, shooting glares at his wife. "Do you even know how to hold her?" "You're making it worse." "I've tried everything, Richard," she said softly, bouncing the baby against her shoulder. She's just upset." "Upset?" he snapped. "She's embarrassing me. Everyone is staring." Passengers were indeed staring. A man 2 rows back sighed loudly, while a woman across the aisle muttered about parents who can't control their kids. The flight attendants hurried up and down, offering water, blankets, even warm bottles, but nothing worked. The baby's cries only rose higher, echoing through the cabin. Malik sat a few rows away, clutching his backpack to his chest. He could feel the tension, the weight of every annoyed eye in the room. He remembered nights at home when his sister wouldn't stop crying, how he had learned the rhythm that calmed her. The way humming in a steady, gentle tone made her breathing slow. His lips parted before he could stop himself. When a flight attendant passed by, he whispered, "Try walking with her, slow steps, and hum softly. It helps." The attendant blinked, surprised. "Oh," she said, leaning closer. "It's like—" "Babies can feel your heartbeat," Malik continued, his voice low. "When you stay calm, they calm down too." The attendant gave a small nod, almost grateful. But before she could move, a sharp voice cut through. "What did you just say?" Malik froze. Richard was leaning over the aisle, his face twisted with irritation. Malik stammered, his voice quiet. "You think you know better than me? Than her mother? Than trained staff?" Richard's voice grew louder, drawing more eyes. "You're just some kid. Sit down and mind your own business." Heat rushed to Malik's face. He tried to shrink into his seat, but Richard wasn't finished. "People like you should learn to stay in your lane," Richard sneered, his words dripping with disdain. "What do you know about raising children, about anything? Just keep to yourself." Passengers turned to look. Some smirked, others looked away awkwardly. No one defended Malik. The humiliation burned deep. He had only wanted to help, but his kindness was met with scorn. The flight attendant tried to step in. "Sir, he was only—" "Enough," Richard barked. "Focus on doing your job instead of letting children give you advice." Malik dropped his eyes to the floor, his hands trembling as he gripped his backpack tighter. He wished he could disappear, vanish into the hum of the engines. The sting of Richard's words cut deeper than the stares. It wasn't just rejection. It was dismissal, the kind that told him he didn't belong, that his voice had no place in this world. Minutes dragged like hours. The baby cried on, her mother's arms shaking with exhaustion. Finally, one of the attendants, ignoring Richard's glare, tried Malik's suggestion. She lifted the baby gently, pacing slowly down the aisle, humming softly. To everyone's surprise, the baby's cries softened. Within moments, the piercing wails melted into soft whimpers, then quiet breaths. A hush fell over the cabin. Passengers sighed in relief. A woman smiled faintly. A man muttered, "Finally." Richard sat stiff in his seat, his jaw clenched. He glanced at the attendant, then at his wife, then back at the now sleeping child. "See?" he said loudly. "All she needed was to be handled properly. Told you." The flight attendant hesitated but said nothing. She placed the baby gently back in her mother's arms. The mother gave a grateful nod, but her eyes flicked briefly toward Malik, just for a second, as if she knew the truth. But Richard's voice drowned out everything else. "Finally, some competence," he muttered, leaning back with smug satisfaction. Malik sat frozen in his seat. His idea had worked, but no one acknowledged him. Instead, the credit was stolen, his role erased as if he hadn't spoken at all. The ache in his chest grew heavy, pressing down until he could barely breathe. He pressed his forehead against the cold window and whispered so softly no one could hear. "Why do I even try?" The city lights below blurred into streaks as tears filled his eyes. For Malik, the lesson was clear. Being right didn't matter if the world refused to see him, and in that moment he felt smaller than ever. The cabin had grown quieter now, save for the occasional rustle of pages, the clink of glasses, and the steady hum of the engines. The baby slept finally at peace, but Malik's heart was far from it. He sat stiff in his seat, staring out at the endless stretch of darkness beyond the window. His reflection looked back at him, small, tired, invisible. Every word Richard had hurled at him echoed in his head. "Stay in your lane. People like you should learn to keep quiet." He replayed it over and over, the sting deepening each time. He had spoken with kindness, with knowledge, but none of it mattered. All the passengers had seen was a poor black boy, someone unworthy of being heard. Malik gripped his backpack tighter, pressing it into his chest like armor. Inside were the few belongings he carried. A worn photograph of his mother, a small toy his sister used to chew on, and a notebook filled with scribbled dreams. His mother's voice rose in his memory, soft but steady. "Your patience is a gift, Malik. The world may not see it now, but one day, they will." But sitting there in the stale air of the cabin, he doubted her words. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe patience was useless in a world that only respected money, power, and faces like Richard's. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he was back in their small apartment. His sister's cries filled the night, sharp and desperate. His mother, exhausted from double shifts, handed the baby to him and whispered, "She needs calm, not more noise." Malik had walked the tiny living room humming softly, until his sister finally fell asleep against his shoulder. In that moment, his mother's proud smile had been brighter than any light, but those nights were gone. His mother was gone. His sister was gone too, placed in foster care after the funeral. And Malik was left with nothing but memories and a gnawing emptiness that no one on this plane could see. He whispered into the quiet, "Maybe no one will ever see me." Meanwhile, in first class, Richard poured himself another drink, his face tight with frustration. He leaned toward one of his colleagues seated nearby, a man who had recognized him the moment he boarded. "Can you believe this?" Richard muttered, his voice low but sharp. "First the delay, then my own child screaming like a banshee. And in front of investors, no less. Do you know what this does to my reputation?" The colleague nodded politely, though his eyes darted away. Richard didn't notice. He straightened his cufflinks, trying to shake off the unease creeping at the edges of his pride. The truth was, he hadn't known what to do when his daughter cried. He had no patience, no instinct for it. His wealth could buy silence in boardrooms, but it couldn't soothe a baby's scream. And worse, a boy, a nobody, had dared to suggest something he hadn't thought of first. Richard sipped his drink, scowling. Children these days think they know everything. They should learn their place. But even as he spoke, unease pricked at him. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered what he refused to admit. The boy had been right. Two souls sat on the same plane, divided by wealth, race, and pride. Malik wrestled with his invisibility, convinced his gift meant nothing. Richard wrestled with his own weakness, terrified anyone might see through his arrogance. And though neither of them knew it yet, their collision was only just beginning. The hours dragged on. The plane sliced through the night sky, steady and relentless, while inside the cabin the fragile calm began to unravel again. The baby stirred restless in her mother's weary arms. Soon the quiet whimpers grew into sharp cries that pierced the cabin once more. Passengers groaned audibly this time. A businessman muttered under his breath, "Not again." A woman covered her ears with the thin airline pillow. The tension rippled, thick and unavoidable. Richard's face flushed red. He snatched the baby from his wife's trembling arms, bouncing her awkwardly as if force alone could silence her. "Stop it!" he hissed, his voice strained. "You're embarrassing me." The cries only grew louder. His wife's eyes glistened with tears. "Richard, please, you're scaring her." But Richard ignored her, his jaw locked with pride and frustration. The baby writhed against him, her small fists flailing, her cries rattling the air like thunder. Malik pressed his forehead against the cold window again, trying to shut it out. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He had already tried once. He had already been humiliated. Why risk that again? But as the cries sharpened, cutting through his chest, he remembered his sister. He remembered her small hands gripping his shirt, the way she finally calmed when he whispered lullabies. He remembered his mother's tired smile and her words, "Your patience is a gift, Malik." The gift burned inside him now, aching to be used. He glanced around. Every passenger was restless, some glaring openly at the family. His heart pounded, his palms sweaty, but something stronger than fear urged him to stand. "Don't do it," he whispered to himself. "You'll just get crushed again." And then a gentle hand rested on his shoulder. He looked up to see Rosa, the flight attendant who had noticed him earlier. Her tired eyes softened with encouragement. She leaned down and whispered, "You were right before. Don't let his anger silence you. Sometimes the person everyone ignores is the only one who sees clearly." Malik swallowed hard, his throat dry. "But he'll just laugh at me again." "Maybe," Rosa said softly. "But maybe this time he'll have no choice but to listen." The baby's screams filled the pause between them. Malik's hands shook as he pushed himself to his feet. His knees wobbled, but he steadied them. His heart thumped loud in his ears as he stepped into the aisle. Richard's head snapped up instantly. "Sit down," he barked, his voice booming with authority. "You're not touching my child." Malik froze, heat rushing up his neck. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, to sink back into his seat and disappear. But then the baby wailed louder, her tiny body arching in distress. Malik's gaze met the mother's, her face pale, eyes rimmed red with exhaustion. In her expression he saw not judgment but pleading. She whispered, barely audible, "Let him try." The cabin seemed to still at her words. Passengers turned their heads, eyes widening. The flight attendants exchanged glances. Even Rosa stepped closer, adding gently, "It couldn't hurt." Richard's face darkened with rage. "This is ridiculous. He's just a boy. He doesn't know anything." But murmurs rippled through the cabin. A man called out, "At least let someone try something." Another woman said sharply, "We're all tired, just give him a chance." Richard clenched his teeth, glaring at Malik with a hatred that masked his fear of losing control. Finally, with a sharp, bitter tone, he spat, "Fine, 1 minute. When you fail, maybe then you'll learn to stay in your place." Malik's chest tightened, but he nodded slowly. His hands trembled as he stepped closer, the weight of every eye on the plane pressing down on him. He had never felt so small, yet at the same time something inside him swelled, an ember refusing to die. He extended his arms. The mother hesitated only a moment before placing the crying child gently into them. Malik's heart lurched as the tiny body squirmed against him, hot tears soaking his shirt. He held her close, cradling her the way he had cradled his sister, steadying his breath, letting calm replace the fear. Richard folded his arms tightly, muttering, "This is absurd." But Malik barely heard him. He hummed softly, the melody shaky at first, then stronger. The same lullaby his mother used to sing. The baby's cries faltered, softened. Malik swayed gently, matching the rhythm of his hum to the rhythm of his heartbeat. The cabin hushed. Passengers leaned in, breath caught in disbelief. The baby whimpered once, twice, then let out a small sigh. Her fists unclenched, her tiny body relaxed against Malik's chest. The cries melted into silence. For the first time that flight, peace settled over the cabin. The silence that followed felt unreal, almost sacred. The baby's breathing slowed against Malik's chest, her tiny head nestled into the curve of his shoulder. For a moment, the chaos of the flight dissolved into something fragile and profound. Passengers stared in awe. A woman whispered, "He did it." A man near the aisle shook his head, muttering, "Unbelievable." The tension that had gripped the cabin softened into sighs of relief. Quiet chuckles and the gentle rustle of people relaxing into their seats again. Richard sat frozen, his face drained of color, his jaw clenched so tight it trembled. His arms were still folded, but his composure cracked with every second of silence that stretched on. The truth was plain. The boy he had ridiculed, the boy he had dismissed as nothing, had done what he could not. Malik kept humming softly, steady and sure. He felt the baby's warmth, the rhythm of her tiny heartbeat. For the first time in days, a sense of peace settled in his chest. His mother's lullaby, the one she'd sung to him and his sister, carried through him like a bridge between the past and the present. Rosa, standing nearby, whispered in awe, "Patience really is a gift." Richard snapped his head toward her. This is a fluke," he hissed, his voice shaking with desperation. "Babies cry." She was bound to stop eventually, but his words sounded weak, hollow, even to himself. The mother, tears streaming down her cheeks, reached out a trembling hand to stroke her daughter's head. She looked at Malik with gratitude etched in her tired face. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're an angel." Malik shifted slightly, his voice quiet but steady. "I didn't do it for thanks, I couldn't watch her suffer." The cabin stirred at his words. A few passengers clapped softly, then louder, until the sound grew into scattered applause. Richard's face reddened as the noise swelled around him, each clap a reminder of the power he had failed to show. He shot up from his seat, pointing a shaking finger at Malik. "Enough of this circus. He's just a boy. Don't act like he's some kind of hero." The clapping faded, replaced by a thick silence. Dozens of eyes turned to Richard, but none with sympathy. A voice from the back called out, "He calmed your baby, didn't he?" Another added, "Show some respect." Richard's mouth opened, but no words came. His pride, so carefully guarded, had been ripped apart by the undeniable truth staring back at him. Malik met his glare, his own fear replaced with a strength he hadn't known he carried. For the first time, he lifted his chin high, refusing to shrink back. You think I don't know what it's like to be dismissed? To be invisible? But I do. And still I chose to care. Because care is stronger than pride. The words hung heavy in the air, sharper than any insult Richard had thrown earlier. The mother nodded, tears spilling freely now. He did what no one else could, she said, her voice trembling but strong. Not even you. Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. His chest heaved with silent rage, but behind it something cracked. An old fear, an unspoken weakness. For the first time in a long time, he had no control. Malik handed the baby gently back to her mother, who clutched her daughter tightly, whispering prayers of relief. The flight attendants smiled, their eyes glistening. Rosa placed a hand on Malik's shoulder, her voice firm but proud. Don't ever let anyone tell you your gift doesn't matter. The passengers murmured in agreement, nodding toward Malik, some even offering smiles of encouragement. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. Richard sank back into his seat, defeated but unwilling to admit it. He poured himself another drink with shaky hands, muttering under his breath, "This means nothing." But his eyes betrayed him, haunted, unsettled, and burning with the realization that a boy he had mocked had exposed his weakness in front of everyone. Malik sat down again, his backpack pressed gently against his knees. But this time he wasn't curling into himself. He sat taller, his chest lighter. He whispered softly, almost like a prayer. You were right, Mama. They see it now. The rest of the cabin relaxed into quiet. The hum of the engines filled the silence, but it was no longer oppressive. It felt like calm, like healing. And for Malik, that moment was more than just a victory. It was the first time he had been seen, not as a burden, not as a shadow, but as someone who mattered. The rest of the flight passed with a peace no one had expected. The baby slept soundly, her small breath steady against her mother's chest. The cabin, once on edge, softened into calm conversation and hushed relief. But the quietest victory belonged to Malik. For the first time, he didn't feel invisible. People looked at him differently now, not with suspicion, not with dismissal, but with respect. A businessman leaned across the aisle and offered his hand. Well done, son, he said, his voice sincere. Malik shook it hesitantly, unused to such recognition. A woman nearby smiled warmly. You have a gift, she whispered. Don't ever doubt that. The flight attendants stopped by often, each offering their gratitude. Rosa bent close, her words steady and sure. What you did today, don't forget it. This world might not always be kind, but moments like this prove you're stronger than it. Malik nodded, his chest tight with emotion. He wanted to believe her. For once, he almost did. Richard sat stiffly in his seat, his face pale, his pride shattered. He muttered a strained, "Thank you," barely audible, as if the words burned on his tongue. Malik glanced at him, but instead of anger, he felt something unexpected. Pity. Here was a man with wealth and power, yet so bound by pride that he couldn't see the value in humility. Malik didn't need his approval anymore. The cabin's respect, the mother's tears of gratitude, the baby's calm in his arms, that was more than enough. When the plane finally landed, passengers gathered their belongings, but many paused to clap Malik on the shoulder or whisper words of encouragement. The mother approached him, holding her sleeping child close. You were her angel tonight, she said softly, her eyes shining. And mine too. Thank you. Malik smiled faintly, his throat too tight to answer. He simply nodded, the weight of her words sinking deep. As they walked off the plane, Rosa lingered behind to whisper one last thing. The world saw you tonight. Malik, don't ever let them forget it. Stepping into the crowded airport, Malik clutched his worn backpack. The grief of his mother's absence still pressed heavy on him, the ache of losing his sister still sharp. But tonight something had shifted. He wasn't just a boy lost in the shadows. He was a boy who had been seen, truly seen for what he carried inside. His mother's voice echoed in his heart. Your patience is a gift. One day they will see it, and now they had. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass windows, not as distant walls, but as horizons waiting to be crossed. Malik took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped forward. For the first time in his life, the world didn't feel so impossible. It felt like the beginning. The flight became a memory for most passengers. Just another story to tell at dinners or in passing conversations. But for Malik, it was more than a memory. It was a turning point. He walked out of the airport that night carrying the same backpack, wearing the same worn clothes. On the surface, nothing had changed. Yet inside, everything had. For the first time, Malik felt the weight of dignity settle in his chest. It wasn't about applause or headlines, or even the whispered thanks of strangers. It was about knowing he had stood tall in a world that tried to make him small. For so long, he had believed the lies of invisibility. He thought that because of his poverty, his skin, his age, his voice carried no worth. But when a child needed calm, it was his patience that mattered. Not wealth, not status, not arrogance. His gift had spoken louder than prejudice. Richard Bennett flew back to his world of glass towers and boardrooms, still wrapped in pride, but haunted by something he could not dismiss. A poor black boy had done what he could not, and though Richard might never admit it aloud, a crack had formed in the wall of his arrogance. Even the powerful cannot escape truth forever. Malik's story spread beyond that cabin. A few passengers shared it online, where strangers read about the boy who had soothed a millionaire's baby mid-flight. Some dismissed it, others celebrated it. But for those who had been overlooked, unheard, or silenced, Malik's act became something more. A reminder that resilience lives where the world least expects it. Malik didn't need the world's permission to be valuable. He carried that worth within him all along. The flight only forced others to finally see what he had always known deep down. Patience, compassion, and dignity are stronger than prejudice, and that truth could not be taken away. As he stepped into the night air, Malik lifted his eyes to the city lights stretching across the horizon. They no longer looked like barriers. They looked like possibilities. For the first time, he didn't just believe his mother's words. He lived them. Your patience is a gift, Malik. One day they will see it. Now they had.